Question number 1. Minnesota has some of the highest commercial property taxes in the nation. Number 6 for metro properties and number 2 for rural properties. Do you support business property tax relief, and if so, how would you ensure this happens in 2016?
Well, first of all, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here with my friends at Twin West. When Senator Bach asked me to take his spot, I thought, aren't I lucky to go speak to my very own chamber and share with you what I think. So I'm going to tell you that I will speak on behalf of where I think the Senate Democrats are, and then if I disagree, I'll let you know that on the side. So, with regard to business property tax, I know it's one of the Twin West priorities to eliminate the statewide commercial property tax. I share that belief that we ought to do that. Will we get it done this session? I don't know, because it's expensive. Senator Rest, who's actually doing the same thing in Rochester this morning, heads up our property tax and tax reform committee, and I asked her if we were going to get it done, and she said, it's expensive. Remind them that we cut a deal many years ago, and we said that we'll institute that tax to help our schools, and then and we also counted on the seasonal in that, and I think we ought to get rid of that too. But she said, and then it changed. It went into the general fund, and that shouldn't have happened. And now to back it out, there's a big price tag. So it really depends on what the targets are and what we can come to agreement on. I think that's something that we ought to focus on this session. I think we ought to do what we can to give our business community the best chance of being competitive on a national basis, especially when I saw the news about the federal action on the internet tax. So that was disappointing.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us here again this year. We're gearing up and getting excited about a session that I think will probably go by very quickly, so we're going to have to be very focused. But this is obviously one of my caucus's priorities, to do some significant tax relief for Minnesota, not just Minnesota employers, but for Minnesotans as well. This is in our tax bill, and it is a priority for us. As I think about this policy and where it came from, and I do know the history of where it came from and how it got there, but I always think it's funny. The state collects property tax on 2 segments of properties, okay? Commercial property and seasonal recreational, so people's cabins, right? What do those 2 properties have in common? There's not a single voter at any of them, right? And you wonder how these things happen. And you wonder if it was good policy or if it was good politics. And I think you can come to that conclusion on your own. And it's time that we set politics aside and do things that are good policy. And Minnesota is not competitive right now on its property taxes for our employers. And it shocks me always how much time we spend in St. Paul trying to figure out how to get more revenue into the state of Minnesota. And I would love if we could spend 2 years simply focused on how do we get more revenue into Minnesota family budgets. Because if we did that and we were successful, we wouldn't have to worry about a single thing at the state of Minnesota. The revenue would come in. And unfortunately, we continue to always put the cart before the horse. And I think we have a real opportunity with a continued surplus to do some significant tax relief that's going to help Minnesota become more competitive again. And I was talking to Terry when I came up here. We have a theme for this next election. We want to make Minnesota great again, and we're going to get some hats. So we can start with a tax bill.
Good morning. I'm David Hand. I'm state senator from Eden Prairie and represent part of Minnetonka. Thanks for having us here. With respect to the business property tax, members of our caucus have supported that. We share, frankly, the same commitments that the speaker just talked about. And it is important to recognize that we do have a very large surplus, which simply means that we are collecting more money than what our budget asks for, to the tune of over $1 billion. So yes, doing property tax relief, I guess, is expensive if you count it that way, but it's also very necessary. So I think that if we do have a tax bill, and at the close of the special session last spring, we got into a little bit of an argument about how to pass some bills, and in the course of that, we had a discussion with Majority Leader Bach, and he did commit to the minority in the Senate that we would have a tax bill. And we didn't talk about specifics in terms of what exactly was going to be in it, but there was an agreement that it was going to be a significant tax bill. So we are looking forward to that. We are looking forward to the redemption of that commitment on the part of the majority. And we think that business property tax ought to be included in that. But as I think Senator Limmer pointed out, we're in an election year, and this is the issue that Democrats love to demagogue. So we're concerned about whether or not the Democrats are going to let a business property tax cut go through, or is it going to be construed as bailing out the wealthy. We hope that's not what happens, but we're fearful of that.
Thank you, and thanks for having us all here today. This is always a great event. So I think that there is going to be a good, solid discussion around the property tax relief. The only thing that I would say, we do have $1.2 billion surplus. Some hundred millions of that are ongoing. Some of it won't recur into the future. And as you kind of plan your budgets, I know, you want to make sure that we're looking at the money that's going to be there kind of on an ongoing basis and not spend one-time money, because that can get you into trouble. What I would say about what we know about the phasing out of the business property tax that was in the House tax bill last year is that 5 years from now, that bill is going to remove over $2 billion, over $1 billion a year out of our system. So if we have a couple $100 million of ongoing surplus and you're taking $1 billion out, that starts to set you up to get back into the cycle of deficits that we came through over the last decade. And so I think we just need to pay attention to math when we talk about this. So I think that this is going to be a robust discussion we have, but hopefully people have their calculators out as they're thinking about how to proceed on this. But I think there's something as important that you should all be paying attention to as we go into this session on the tax bill. And seasonal rec was raised as kind of that. The reason that got slipped in, and it literally got slipped in the early 2000s at the last minute. It didn't get committee hearings. It didn't go through the system. It got slipped in the dark of night at the end of session. We saw that again last year with many, many provisions, even though we didn't get a tax bill. I think one thing that we should really, really be paying attention to this year, because we have a conference committee, bills just sitting in conference committee where there won't be public hearings, where there won't be it'll be a lot of background work going on behind the scenes. I think people should stand up and demand that we have more transparency in how we conduct our sessions. And that's the way you avoid slipping things like seasonal rec into a tax bill without anybody knowing it. So I'm hoping that people will stand up and say, and demand of legislative leaders, us up here, and of their legislators, that they're willing to make sure we know what is in the bills that we're voting on, that there's time built in to allow the public to weigh in, that deadlines are set to allow for that, because if we don't do that, we run into bad public policy. And that's something that we should at all costs avoid.
Thank you. On to question 2, starting with Speaker Doubt. Business relies on a transportation system that is safe and reliable. Twin West supports passing a 10-year comprehensive funding package that maintains our system and provides for strategic congestion relief. Understanding that transportation is a core function of our state government, we think it is reasonable to use a portion of the general fund for that purpose. Using bonding to finance projects like the completion of the Southwest Light Rail Line and other road and bridge projects is favored as well. What steps will you take to ensure that the 2016 legislative session yields a transportation bill?
Well, thank you for the question. We obviously in my caucus, this has been a big priority of ours, passing a comprehensive transportation plan. We came out with maybe I'll even back up earlier than that. The governor, in response to the TFAC report, which came out in 2012, came out with a proposal to raise the gas tax, and I think we all know the history on that, not just raise the gas tax, but the largest gas tax increase in state history at a time when we had a $2 billion surplus. And the reason I'm saying that, I know you all know that, but that sets up the argument, do we use some of that surplus in our general fund to pay for something which by the way, is a constitutionally defined core function of state government? The Constitution only outlines a few things. It's educating our kids, public safety, and it literally says roads and bridges. So the logic there is at a time when we have a surplus, and to me a core function of state government is you pay for those things first before you pay for other things. So at a time when we have a surplus, record surplus, $2 billion, we're going to raise a new tax to pay for something that is a core function of state government. Anybody wonder what's wrong with St. Paul? Nope, I don't see anybody shaking their head. Yeah, they do. No, nobody wonders what's wrong. That's what's wrong with St. Paul. You know, we can't go there and do the business that people sent us to do. We have to think of some creative new way to pay for something. And the reason was simple. The governor had that $2 billion spent mentally on other things, and instead of spending it on our priorities. And especially at a time when Minnesota families didn't have that surplus in their own budgets. So we proposed, in response to that, paying for the same amount of money into road and bridge infrastructure over the same period of time, 10 years, and we proposed doing it with existing revenue sources. So it was sales tax on auto parts, sales tax on leased vehicles, sales tax on rental cars, and we were supplementing it with some bonding dollars, which the governor was also proposing. We think all of those things make sense, and they have broad support from the public. We are still in a position to do that. We wanted to do that last year, but frankly had to leave that on the sidelines when we closed out session, frankly because Democrats weren't willing to do a tax bill and a transportation bill if we wouldn't raise the gas tax. I think everybody's pretty aware of that was the standoff at the end of session. And we knew that it wasn't appropriate to take more money out of Minnesota family budgets when the state had a surplus and could solve this problem without doing that. So we're gonna have that same conversation this session. The governor, the good news was in the February forecast, or excuse me, in the November forecast, the governor said that a gas tax was off the table. We think that's good news. We think that will make it easier to solve the problem this session. However, since then, he has tried to reel that back in, and I think everybody knows what's going on. That's a negotiating position. Nobody believes that there's going to be a gas tax, including the governor himself. There won't be, I guarantee it, and we will solve this problem this session. We're going to do it together in a bipartisan fashion, and we're going to do it without a gas tax.
I think that in the last session, our transportation lead senator, John Peterson from St. Cloud, was very, very active working with the House leadership to try to craft this bill that the speaker has described. We think it makes sense, especially in a time of surplus, to look at taking existing revenue streams and dedicate some of those to augment our road and bridge infrastructure needs. The gas tax, we think, is a bad idea in the Senate Republican caucus. However, it is not a bad idea necessarily for our friends on the other side of the aisle. I remember being here at Twin West a couple of weeks ago and heard Senator Ann Rest get up and say that the gas tax is not off the table. And I've heard the Senate Majority Leader Bach say the same thing. So it may be a negotiating tactic, I don't know, but I expect that we're going to see a proposal on the Senate floor for a substantial increase in gas taxes. It'll likely pass with the majority we have in the Senate. We oppose that. We think there is room to do real funding for needed infrastructure, but do it in a way that doesn't add additional tax burden to the economy. We're in favor of that. We're going to work very hard to get it done, and I'm optimistic at this point that we will see some progress.
Well, again, I guess what I would do is just we have to come back to math, and I like that the way that that the question is framed up, because from our perspective, from my perspective, what we need to do on transportation is have something that fixes the problem for the long term, which is how you all have taken the same position. And if you actually go in and do the math on the proposal that the Republicans have put out there, it doesn't add up. I am fine, frankly, using some of the general fund ideas. And in fact, we put on the table before the special session last year, doing just that, using some of the tax on auto parts as an example, the sales tax that currently is taxed, and using that as part of the way to get a transportation bill done. But if you do that and some of the other things that the speaker mentioned, it still doesn't add up to a solution that solves the problem a long time for roads and bridges. The other piece that is never discussed by the Republicans and is not part of their proposal is any investment whatsoever in transit, which in the metropolitan area, whether you believe it or not, and I know most of you people in this room believe it. You know, I just talked to one of my best friends from well, when I was 5 years old till now, so a long time ago, who works downtown, lives in Eden Prairie, just started working downtown. You know, he takes the bus in every day, right? Transit is used by lots of people. In the city that I work in, you know, I work at Lindquist and Benham, downtown Minneapolis. We have 40,000 people coming into Minneapolis every day on transit. So it's a place that we need to make an investment you never hear the word transit coming out of the mouths of Republicans. That actually is going to be the big hangup in getting to a transportation bill. I think that we can hopefully, if there's some willingness to look at the real math on roads and bridges, we can get there. But if there's going to be a hard line saying we are never going to do transit, and I would like someone to ask the leadership of the Republicans, are they going to support Southwest Light Rail this year? Because that may be a place where is going to be another hang-up on actually getting a transportation bill done. So don't believe the hype that this is just about the gas tax. If someone can come up with a plan that funds roads and bridges in a way that actually solves the problem, I'm all in on that, and I have said that from the very beginning, whether it includes the gas tax or not. But the big hang-up this year is going to be whether the Republicans are going to be willing to touch the third rail of the Republican Party and say transit is okay.
Well, I'm going to take a different approach because in this case, I stand with the Senate Democrats. And we really do believe there should be a strong, comprehensive transportation bill. And the reason why we continue to support a gas tax, and by the way, you know, we talk about the rhetoric about taking money, you know, from hardworking families, but just think about it. A nickel, and I'm not saying this is the Senate proposal, they actually proposed something different, but imagine it was a nickel on the gas tax. Is that really going to be such a dramatic hit into people's families? I don't think so. What I think is worse is when businesses have to deal with 169 closed for a year. Or like this past year, how we all had to deal with a Highway 100 fix. At the same time, you had a Highway 494 fix. Thank goodness we had a Highway 494 fix after, you know, really it was the people in this room who demanded that after so many years. But we can't afford to let our infrastructure go the way it's gone. We have to be responsible as policymakers and take some tough votes. And recently, we did some research. Many states in the past year have passed additional gas tax increases, and most of them had Republican governors. So I actually don't think this is a partisan issue. I think it's a philosophical issue. And with regard to the suggestions about taking various taxes from the general fund and putting them towards transportation, the first year I was in office, I carried the bill to move the tax on leased vehicles to transportation. And I did that because we passed a constitutional amendment saying that taxes on automobiles belong in transportation. And then we didn't put the lease taxes. And I know in our suburban communities, we lease our vehicles. Many people do that. And so we aren't actually doing the will of the people, and I think that doesn't have integrity. So I do support that. But where do you stop? If you say, oh, if you pay a tax on goods at Walgreens that are pharmaceuticals, should that go towards a health and human services budget? Or if you have some expenses in another category, should we have the nexus be that goes to support that? That's not really workable. You want to have flexibility with regard to the general fund, and you want to be careful about picking individual things. So we in the Senate are going to courageously take a strong stand on a comprehensive tax bill. We've already voted on the gas tax. We probably don't need to do that again, Senator Hand. I think we've done it every year. But what I will also say is that this idea of the Southwest Light Rail and thinking we can do that in the bonding bill is really a pipe dream, because a bonding bill, you have to get 2/3 majority. We aren't most likely going to get a 2/3 majority vote for a transit project in the bonding bill. So our only hope for the Southwest, in my opinion, and this would not be a caucus position because I don't know that my leadership feels as strongly about Southwest as those of us in this room, I believe you have to pass the local option sales tax to raise our transit tax to probably 1 cent. And I look at Commissioner Callison back there, and I know she's worked so hard on finding the resources and the plan for this. But I think that's really the only way. I didn't used to support that. I thought, you're talking about a project that's going to last this community for 20 to 100 years, and you're going to pay as you go for that? I don't think that's smart. I think you'd be better off putting it in the bonding bill. I just don't think that's the political reality, and I think that's why Denver and Portland and all the other cities that have done comprehensive transit projects have used the sales tax in order to accomplish that.
Thank you. Question number 3, starting with Senator Han. Recent activity by local governments to enact wage and benefit mandate on private businesses are concerning to businesses of all sizes. This practice disrupts the employment market and creates a patchwork of labor laws. Business supports a preemption that prevents such governmental overreach. What is your position on wage and benefits mandated by local governments and imposed on private businesses?
Well, thank you. We oppose that. We do think that it raises real concerns. I know some of the discussion in Minneapolis recently about doing some things that would put additional burdens on businesses in Minneapolis when across the street in Edina or another city, those same tax structures or those same regulatory structures don't exist. That is not helpful to our business climate. And I think for many of us, we have worked for many years to try to improve the strength of the business climate in Minnesota, make it strong for investment. And when we do these things, I think it's a very, very strong disincentive for business to invest. And we heard that loud and clear during the debate that Minneapolis was having. I think, and frankly, I'm a little fearful that because of that, we will see a push at the state legislative level to take those kinds of regulations and make them statewide. And in other words, to solve the problem of having local regulations and just make all those regulations statewide. I hope that is not the case, but I am fearful that that is going to be the response from the majority in the Senate.
Well, I think what Senator Han just said is the answer to resolving these issues on the local level. Because I agree that there are some challenges with doing it patchwork. What we should do is resolve some of these things at the statewide level. So things like earned sick leave and things like paid time off for parents when they have young kids. We talk a lot about early childhood education, getting the best start. The very best thing that we can do for our youngest kids to get them on the best start is to make sure that they build up a relationship with their parents. That relationship, that bond, probably has more to do with the success of a kid than maybe anything else in the whole world. And but we in this country have decided that that's not a priority for us. And so I think we should move at the state, and we will be talking about at the state level, talking about moving forward on paid parental leave, moving forward on earned sick and safe time, because I think those are things that will actually ultimately, help millions of people in the state of Minnesota, and also help our business climate. It's going to make our biggest advantage is the fact that we have productive a workforce, and I think that that's going to be a critical part of it. I also, though, want to say, we have been talking to a lot of small businesses about this across the state over the last year, partly because this debate arose. And out of those conversations has come a package of ideas that Representative Paul Rosenthal and other folks in the Democrats on the Democratic caucus are actually announcing kind of as we speak around small business. And it's going to be, for instance, one of the things we've heard a lot about is the impact of the state revenue department and the audits that they impose on a pretty aggressive basis on small businesses. And so we're going to have a package of proposals to make that process much more streamlined, much easier on businesses, on small businesses, allowing some discretion at the Department of Revenue so that they don't have to impose fines, allowing the Department of Revenue to issue private letter rulings so people can get certainty in advance, something we don't do at the state level, and really deal with this issue of making sure that when businesses are trying to do the right thing, but they run into complicated regulations, we're not punishing them, we're helping them. We're also going to move forward on one of the other things we heard is that as small businesses, they don't have access, they don't have staff that can go out and kind of figure out all the pieces of assistance that are out there to help them navigate regulations, to help them work through and access grants and other economic development tools. We're going to make sure that every small business that opens in the state of Minnesota gets reached out to and communicated and connected to so that they are all helped and all understand and not put at a disadvantage to larger businesses to make sure that they're on an equal playing field. The third thing that we're going to do is tax conformity. Every year we go through this thing where you have to file your taxes. The federal government is trying to change the tax laws. Minnesota doesn't catch up. and then you gotta file your taxes, and then halfway through the tax season, Minnesota finally figures out, well, we ought to comply with some of those federal tax changes, and then you have to file an amended return, causing great deal of unnecessary work, unnecessary cost. We're proposing that we actually conform to those tax cuts that are in the federal bill every year automatically, so that we don't have this annual cycle of having to file your taxes and then having to file amended taxes. I think that there are some very practical things that we can do to help business if we actually go out and listen and then respond to them. You know, it's great to go out and just listen to people and then say we're gonna do stuff. I think the true test of leadership of the legislature is actually doing something. That's something that we haven't seen in the last year, quite frankly. We didn't get a tax bill done. We didn't get a transportation bill done. We left lots of things on the table, and the fact that we spent 3 months trying to figure out whether we could help people on the Iron Range and deal with Real ID, which is the simplest thing in the world to solve if we just sat down in a room for one day. It took 3 months to figure out we couldn't even fix those things. I dread to think what dealing with a tax bill and transportation bill this year is going to look like.
Well, let's see, the question.
We'll get back.
I
What is your
remember. Never
wage and
mind,
benefits?
I remember. It's okay, man. It is really problematic to have our cities tackle some of the issues around benefits, whether it be family leave or earned sick pay. I met with Twin West, and they shared some of their concerns about if you've got a business that is moving goods that goes through the city of Minneapolis, then all of a sudden they are now under the regulations that the city of Minneapolis decides. And so I think that situation is untenable. And so I do think it is a better approach to have a statewide prohibition on doing it by locale. And in fact, Lyle Coonan, a state senator from Worthington area, I believe. Wilmer, thank you. He carried that bill in the Senate, and so our caucus was involved in that. I don't know where they stand right now on that. But as the only woman sitting up here at the table, I wanted to talk for a minute about parental leave, because my oldest son is 31, and my next son is 27, and both times I had my children, I quit my job. I had a 20-year career. I left the family business where I was the vice president because I didn't want to be the boss's daughter and be the only one who got to carve out my own, how I was going to take 12 weeks off. And so I just said, fine, I'm not going to do that. I'll quit and I'll go back to work in a year. Then I was at Tonka Toys in a position I loved, but I could not leave my little one and go back to work at 6 weeks when I was supposed to. And so I quit that job and then ended up back in the toy business. But those were decisions that I wished I hadn't had to make. And now, many in this room, you may have grandchildren, people who are confronting these things. We in our country do not give parents adequate time to bond with their children. And so I think that we ought to tackle that. I think for the good of our future, we should take a stand and conform our policies more similar to what happens in Europe, where they really do the right thing by their little ones. Now, the question is, who bears the burden of that? And I think we have to be creative. You're not the enemy of that. We aren't the enemy of that. We got to be in partnership and say, how could we do this? One idea I have is that we've seen that we have a surplus in the UI fund. Why couldn't we take down the rate, give you some relief on that, and let you manage the whatever that's left if you choose to offer some benefit around parental leave? Or why couldn't we talk to the feds about the amount that you pay into the workforce development funds, which I have a lot of concern about where that money goes, and say that there should be some flexibility to use it for things that we believe are important. So I don't think that we ought to just assume that if we have this conversation at the legislature that we want to do something to make your businesses have one more burden. I think rather let's look at it in partnership and say, is there a way we can make this work and really lead the nation and take a stand for our children and our families?
The question really was about, preemption and would we support language that would not allow local governments to kind of piecemeal different policies all over the state. And it's incredibly difficult for, especially businesses that have multiple locations, to try to navigate an environment where every municipality has a different regulation about their employees and how to manage their employees. So yes, I do support preemption. I think it's a huge priority. I don't think that it makes Minnesota competitive to have these sorts of different regulations at every municipality. Minneapolis was planning to do this. I think they backed away from that now after a lot of pressure. St. Paul is now talking about it, and I don't think it's going to end until the state says, you know what, these are decisions best made at the state level and to be made statewide, so they apply to everybody the same. I think everybody has been on record saying they support preemption, so that should make it very easy to pass, but my guess is it won't be. Because I don't think that people are being honest about whether they really support it or not. And when I say people are on record, I'm told that all of the leaders have said and told different groups that they do support preemption language at the state level. So we're going to try to pass it. We think it's the right thing to do, and if everybody's honest and follows through with that, it should be very easy, but I'm not so sure.
Thank you. After this question, we will take some questions from the audience, so please give some thought if you would like to ask a question here. On this final question, we'll start with Representative Thiessen. Twin West has been a longtime supporter of high-quality early childhood programs and has provided scholarships and grants for programs in high-need neighborhoods and families. We oppose enacting a statewide, expensive, universal pre-K program in public schools. This approach limits parent choice and undermines the business model of child care providers, which could result in a shortage of quality child care for all families. It also places additional tax burden on communities, many who are still working to accommodate all-day K, that will be required to build and maintain classroom space. With quality pre-K options in private and public school settings and scholarships for those in need, this appears to be a solution looking for a problem. What is your position on universal pre-K?
Well, I'm glad that this question is here. I'm going to be entering my 14th year in the legislature, and in the last 3 years, I think something really significant has happened, which is that there is consensus, which didn't exist before, that we need to make investments in pre-K. There was a fight about whether that was even something we ought to be doing. Now we're at a place in Minnesota where everybody knows we need to do it, and we should do it, and it's the right thing to do. The only question is how we go about doing it. We've made some progress on a bipartisan basis. In 2013 and 14, we made a very significant investment in the scholarships. That was added onto in the 2015 session. We're moving in the right direction there. But this is the one thing I would like people to consider about this. So you're a single mom who's making $40,000 a year, $45,000 a year. You have 2 kids who are young. Maybe you're not even a single mom. You're a married couple. But you're making $45,000 to $50,000 a year. Your child care expenses, if you go into the private market, are going to be in the range of $12,000 to $18,000 a year on a $45,000 a year income. So we target our scholarships at people making under $30,000 a year, which is important, and there's a great need there, and it was one of the things we can do to help solve the achievement gap. But what about those people that are living between $30,000 and $50,000 a year? They get nothing. They get no help at all to make the investment that is in the interests of all of us. What we can do with regard to what the benefit of the kind of comprehensive 4-year-old and maybe 3-year-old pre-K as we go into it, and maybe there's some flexibility on whether it's in the schools or not, but it actually helps the people that never get any help. We help the folks that are in most need, the folks that are making under $30,000 a year and are poor, and we need to do that. And then there's folks, like my family, who's very fortunate, where I can afford to do that. But there's this middle that gets squeezed every single time we go over to St. Paul. And that's the folks that we ought to be focusing on when we talk about pre-K, because we can't leave those families behind as much as we have been. That's how we make an economy that works for everybody. And so I hope when we have this discussion, it's not just about helping those in the direst need, but helping those middle-class families to do something that we know benefits every single one of us, because what it allows is more flexibility in their job situation for those families. It allows them to have more money in their pockets, and it makes sure that those kids are getting the best education they can. And the last thing that I would say is I think it's really important that we focus on the quality of what's going on in this early childhood education. And there are some private providers that provide tremendous quality. But having trained teachers or people that are meeting certain standards about, and not just about teaching, but teaching and care, so that's focused on the needs of those youngest people in that age, kids in that age group, I think that that's really, really important as well if we're going to get the bang for our public dollar that we want. So I think this is going to be a really important discussion. Unfortunately, as we've talked about what we're going to do with this $1.2 billion surplus, what we hear is we're going to do tax cuts and we're going to do transportation. And except really for Governor Dayton, nobody has been talking about this third piece, which is investing in our earliest learners, which we've been making progress on, and we need to keep the momentum going. So I really appreciate the question, because I think it's important that we keep this in the public discussion, and I hope that we come to a solution that is broadly based and helps lots and lots of kids get ahead.
Well, Representative Thiessen, I share your being quite surprised and happy that there are so many discussions around early childhood, because it wasn't like that. I am now going to be in my 11th year in the state legislature, and I remember joining the Early Childhood Caucus when I first started, and we were a very small group and we weren't doing much. But I actually was an author of the first early childhood scholarship bills, and so I feel very strongly about this issue, and I feel comfortable speaking from my own perspective to this question, because we don't have a caucus position. We're about divided on this, so I am going to share with you where I stand. The research shows that the greatest return on investment we can possibly make is to give the low-income families, the families most at risk of having their children not be ready for kindergarten, is to provide them with the resources. The way we've structured the early childhood scholarships, number one, because of the support of the business community, who have completely said, we're going to own quality. And they created the Parent Aware system. And so in order for these families to get a scholarship, they have to be enrolling their child in a high-quality pre-education. And in fact, we've scaled how much we give the families based on if they choose quality. If you choose a 4-star rated early childhood experience, you get more money than if you chose 3 or 2. And so I couldn't agree more that quality is important, but I think we've done a wonderful job in the state of making sure our resources are only going towards quality. In addition, we got a report, we had a hearing a couple weeks ago about how parents who are getting these scholarships are choosing to spend them. And what we learned is that the families who got the scholarships, the majority of them were choosing private. And so you ask yourself, why would they choose private when they could also go to the school? I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm asking that question. And what we heard is that a lot of times parents will have more than one little one. And so it's easier if they can take them to the same place. In addition, if they're working, they need the child care wrapped around the education. And so if you're at a New Horizons or if you're at another place, you can, and now we've lifted the cap. We started out saying you can only have $4,000 if you're getting a scholarship, and that didn't even help with child care. We've lifted the cap up to $7,500 so that you can now use those resources flexibly. And we're talking about giving parents who get MFIP the additional support for childcare, linking that to quality. So I know that's, as we call it, a wonky, very detailed explanation for why I stand where I stand, but the thing that I was left with in that hearing is that parents were choosing. We gave them scholarships and they chose to take advantage of the flexibility. And so I am going to continue being a strong champion we've now invested over $40 million in this approach. Let's not walk away from it, and let's not, split and dilute our efforts. If we're not going high enough into the middle class, then let's up our income levels, which I believe, Representative Thiessen, we did. I'm not positive what the number is, but I do believe it's higher than 30,000, but he says no, so I'm going to stick with him because I don't have that in front of me. But we should. We should go higher than that, and I would be for that.
You know, this obviously was the big argument at the end of last session about whether to do universal pre-K or some other form of early education. And really the approach that we took was the approach that we supported in those negotiations, which was investing in the scholarships. And Senator Bonoff said it really well. I mean, this is what the data shows is effective. And a universal one-size-fits-all program is not shown to be as effective. It doesn't have broad support in the legislature. And you know, I think the governor kind of found that out. I think he maybe is even backing away from that position a little bit, although I shouldn't say that. Maybe I'm wrong. He'll get in trouble with the teachers union if I say that. And you know, people always ask me, how did you get to be speaker in your third term? And you know what? It's because I'm really honest. And I just say it like it is. And I'm about to do that, so fair warning. This is really simple. This proposal wasn't pushed by school districts. It wasn't pushed by parents. This was pushed by the teachers union. And if you haven't done the math, it's really easy to figure out why. You increase the dues-paying members of the teachers union by 8 to 10%. Democrats get about 2/3 of their money for their campaigns from the teachers union or from unions. You know, the teachers union alone took out just Education Minnesota. And I'm not picking on teachers, okay? I have the honor of serving in the legislature with my high school teacher, one of my high school teachers, Sandra Erickson, and we have wonderful teachers in Minnesota. But it's important that, and I think our teachers do put kids first, but unfortunately the teachers union itself has a little different agenda. In September of 2014, the teachers union took out a loan for $350,000, a loan against their future dues, and gave it to the House DFL caucus. That's what we're dealing with. And we can't make decisions based off of politics about who supports us in our campaigns and how we can get more money into our campaigns. We literally need to make sure that we're taking care of these kids. And if we can do that, we'll solve this problem. You know, one of the issues in the last, as we negotiated this potential for a special session, Senator Bach originally brought it up, and then Governor Dayton, was the disparity in wages in our minority community, and the fact that these folks aren't making the same amount of money as you know, white folks in the same community. So I brought up that really we can't ignore the fact that this problem comes from the fact that we have the highest achievement gap in the country, which means our low income and minority students aren't getting the same education as our white middle income students, okay? So we have less than a 50% graduation rate for minorities in the Minneapolis school district. And we wonder why they're not making very much money when they get out into the workforce. Nobody should be wondering. It's very obvious. And we can't solve the problem and close that disparity in wages until we deal with the achievement gap. And the way to deal with the achievement gap is you know, it has been shown exactly what Senator Bonoff said, using a targeted approach with scholarships and getting these kids into a program. There are wonderful schools, charter schools, and other schools in Minneapolis that are being very, very successful. But unfortunately, our public school system in Minneapolis isn't having the results it should have. And throwing more money at the problem with no other real reforms is failing those kids. And we have to admit that we are failing those kids. Now, I could put my head in the sand because these kids aren't in my district, right? But I can't because it's the wrong thing to do. And what's right is to solve the problem. And if we have to take on a force like the teachers union in order to solve it, I'm willing to do that. But I'm going to need some help from everybody else sitting up here this morning.
The universal pre-K policy, you've heard probably both sides, all sides of it up here, but I would say one thing. The governor has made a statement publicly that he wants this bad enough that he has said that he would not allow a tax bill to be passed unless we pass all-day universal pre-K. I think that's wrong. I think we should oppose that. I think there are good reasons to oppose it. Art Rolnick is a well-known local economist who has talked a lot about the value of early childhood education with respect to dealing with the achievement gap. And I've talked with Mr. Rolnick on a number of occasions. I've sat down with him, we've gone through the data. And there is data. There are good studies not very many, and they haven't been replicated, but there are some very good studies that show that if you do a very, very targeted intrusion into early childhood education for children who have very, very severe dysfunction in their background, that this does make a difference. Now, that gets extrapolated into universal pre-K. And Art Rolnick will tell you that's not good policy. That's not what we should do. If we are interested in solving the achievement gap, you have to do this in a targeted way. And he supports that, and he says the research supports it. I've looked at the research, and it does. There is no research that says that solving the achievement gap will be done by a commitment to universal preschool. None. And so you have to ask, when the Democrats say we have to do this, are they talking about providing free child care to the middle class, or are they talking about dealing with the achievement gap? Seems like there's a mixed message here. But I will tell you one thing. There's a lot of research on achievement. And the best research, the gold standard research, all the research that is out there says that when you provide robust school choice mechanisms and give families the opportunity to choose their schools and let the money follow the choice, that works. There's a lot of research, far more research than early childhood education, frankly. But that is a topic that will not be discussed. And again, I'll go back to what the speaker said, because Education Minnesota is dead set against any discussion on school choice. They were opposed to open enrollment. They were opposed to PSEO. They were opposed to, and still are opposed to, charter schools. If we want to look at how we solve the achievement gap in Minnesota and education reform, we've got to get out of this stranglehold that Education Minnesota has on education policy. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be talking about this problem 10 years from now. I say it's the problem we love to admire. I've been in the legislature now for 13 years. We've talked about it every year. We pass massive amounts of money. Nothing changes. There has to be a change in the system, and part of it, I think, a big part of it, is making sure that you have a robust choice model in Minnesota.
I just need to jump in a little bit here. So, a couple of things. There's no confusion in my mind on this issue about whether it is targeting and making sure we close the achievement gap, or whether it's providing some relief for those middle-class families that need help with their child care. I think it's both. So there's no confusion in my mind. I think there's a confusion maybe there, but why should we be asking a family making $50,000 a year to be paying for the child care of someone making $20,000 a year without providing any relief to that family that's making $50,000 a year? That is the problem with our politics right now, frankly, is that we are forgetting the middle class. We need to help the folks, and I know that, and I'm fundamentally committed to making sure that we close that achievement gap and we deal with economic disparities beyond that, which most importantly is getting people a job. But we can't forget those middle-class people. And that's what this discussion that you're hearing from the Republicans is all about. They are not willing to put their money where their mouth is to make sure that child care is actually affordable in the state of Minnesota. Ask them to expand CCAP, ask them to do anything. That never leaves their mouths. So let's talk about doing both. The second thing is talking about dumping money into education. If you go around the state and listen to Republican legislators, they are crowing about the money that they put into education last year. So, Kurt thinks he's honest, but if you talk to his members, you might find a different story, because the fact of the matter is they passed a bill that would have strangled our school districts. They put in, I don't know, $150 million, which is a lot of money, but it would have resulted in cuts across the state of Minnesota. They were forced to get to $535 million in an education bill, and now they're going around the state saying, look how great we are because we put so much money into education. And then you hear Kurt Doubt come to the Chamber of Commerce and say, we can't dump money into the hole of education. Which is it, Kurt? Is it what your members are saying, or is it what you're saying? But the last thing I want to say is that if you really want to talk about campaign contributions, then we should pass the Disclose Act. We should make sure that every contribution in the state of Minnesota, every donor that is spending money on campaigns, every expenditure that's being spent on campaigns is disclosed. And these guys refuse to do it. They're not even willing to take the bill up, because, just as an example, this past November, not even an election year, there were 8 mailings that went into a Wilmer legislative district from a thing called the Jobs Coalition. There were 4 mailings that went into St. Cloud. There were a couple of mailings that went into Faribault and Albert Lee. These are arguably statewide issue ads. Interestingly enough, they're only going into races that are competitive legislative races, only districts that are competitive legislative races. None of that spending shows up on any report that any of you can see. So Education Minnesota, at the very least, they're being upfront and honest about that they're actually spending the money. If these folks are really interested in having true disclosure, true understanding of all the flood of money that's rushing through our system that we need to stop because it is turning people off politics and it's distorting our policy, they should support the Disclose Act. And from what I heard Kurt saying today, from the arguments he was making, I would think he would support it. So I hope that when I give him the microphone back, he says I'm 100% with you.
Give me the microphone back. So a couple of things. First of all, my members are damn proud of the money we put into education, and it went to school districts on the formula where they got to choose how to spend it.
That's the black hole you always complain about.
2% and 2%,
You can't
because,
say two things, Kurt.
Paul, I was respectful, and we were the ones, House Republicans, that forced the governor to spend it there. Had we gone with the governor's plan, school districts would have had a huge underfunded mandate of all-day pre-K on the back of universal kindergarten, and school districts don't have the space right now for the all-day kindergarten. Putting another underfunded mandate of universal pre-K would have cost school districts hundreds of millions of dollars in local dollars that would have come out of the classroom. So what we did, we are damn proud of, and I'm not going to apologize to anybody for it. And the fact that school districts got 2% and 2% was because of House Republicans.
That is a total
Period.
bunch of bullshit.
It's not at all. So, and the other thing, Paul, you know, we have to be honest about daycare. I mean, we just started a brand new committee in the House in a bipartisan fashion to deal with the cost of daycare for Minnesotans. We're one of the highest states in the country on daycare. And what did Democrats do? It's right back along the same line of what I talked about with the teachers union. Right now, there's a vote going on whether to unionize daycares, and not the employees that work at a daycare, but the actual business owners. For the first time ever, that's what Democrats passed. And you know what that will do? If that vote passes, and by the way, everybody doesn't get to vote on whether to be in the union or not, just a select few, and I'm a little leery of whether this thing was rigged or not, but what is it going to do? It's going to make daycare in Minnesota for middle-class Minnesotans more expensive. So you got to put your money where your mouth is. Don't pass policies that are going to make daycare more expensive and then sit up here and say that somehow we care about these people because they're paying too much for daycare. There is no need in Minnesota to unionize daycares, and it was the worst policy. Great politics if you're a Democrat and you want campaign contributions, but a horrible policy for middle-class Minnesotans, and I hope it fails miserably.
I just want to acknowledge the time. We are a little tight on time. We'll go to Deb for a quick question or two. Deb's in the audience. If you do have a question, raise your hand.
Thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate your being here. Last year, at a 4-month session, couldn't get a transportation bill or a tax relief bill. You got a 2-month session this year. What is the roadmap to success? How is this going to get done this year?
You want anybody to answer that, or a particular person, or
Go for it.
the speaker wants? Okay.
Sure. You know, I think, as I said earlier, obviously the governor backing away from the gas tax and taking that off the table, I think, is helpful. I know that Senator Bach is still taking that position. His members took a vote for I think it was 6 cents per gallon, if I remember right. Is that right, Terry?
It's a gross receipts tax of 6.5%. It's a weird tax.
Okay. You know, the governor's plan was 16 cents or something per gallon. You know, I think if we can get that off the table, and that really was what held up those two things. I remember sitting in the room at the governor's residence negotiating this at the end of session, and Senator Bach himself, I was at the end of the table. Dayton was on one side, Bach was on the other. And I remember Senator Bach kind of, you know, puffing up his chest and pointing at the table and making an ultimatum that if we weren't willing to do a gas tax, then there wasn't going to be a tax bill and there wasn't going to be a transportation bill. And we were getting to the end of negotiations where we needed to finish our budget. So I called his bluff and I said, great, we're not going to do it then. We'll save that for next year. But I'm also not going to let you spend the money. And we left regular session with $1 billion on the bottom line, first time ever. And believe me, it was not easy to to get Democrats away from spending that money, because believe me, they wanted to. And so, you know, through special session, we spent another $125 million on education. That was great, but we're left with $875 million of surplus. That then turned into another $1.8 billion. We put 600 into reserves, that leaves 1.2 billion. We do have the resources. The thing that I hate the most about what happens in St. Paul is when people try to pit one group of people against another. And we don't need to do that. We don't need new revenue to pay for roads and bridges. We can do that. Paul mentioned transit. I'm happy to talk about transit. I know that there are people in this room that support Southwest Light Rail. The public is not with you. And our members are not with you. And I'm just going to be really honest because that's what I like to do. It is a $2 billion project to put a train into the West Metro, okay? I know it's cool, and a lot of local governments think that it would be great for their city. And you know what? If I was in your city and I could leverage that much federal dollars and state dollars to get that into my city, I'd probably support it. No, I wouldn't. But I don't blame them for supporting it because it's not a stupid thing for them to do. But if our job is to look at the entire state and to spend our dollars wisely and make sure that we're getting a bang for the buck. And the reality is that 98% of Minnesotans, probably more than that, use our road and bridge infrastructure every day as their primary mode of transportation. And that doesn't even take into account getting goods and services to market on our roads and bridges. So the priority needs to be roads and bridges, and I don't believe that anybody is going to hold up something that I believe has broad bipartisan support, putting money into roads and bridges. It'll pass with over 100 votes in the House. To put something on it, specifically light rail, and my caucus isn't against transit. We can support some transit, but the light rail thing is going to be a problem. And the reason is the votes just simply do not exist in the legislature to pass it. And what people hate about what we do in St. Paul is when we take something that isn't popular with the public, that doesn't have enough votes to stand alone, and put it on something that's incredibly popular to ram it through, like the Senate office building, right? That's the kind of thing we're not going to do. If it has enough votes in the House, it'll go in. If it doesn't, it won't. And it's not my responsibility to whip the votes, just like when the governor said his #1 priority was universal pre-K. It's his job. He knows the legislative process. Call some members. I haven't run into a single member yet that the governor called about universal pre-K to ask for support, and I didn't run into a single member yet that he called about any of the 4 ideas he wanted for special session to ask for support. So that's the way the legislative process works. If cities or groups in the West Metro want this, it's your job to get the public support, and it's your job to get legislative support. And if it's there, it'll pass. If it's not, it won't.
Did you guys see a roadmap there?
So, guys.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Number one, the Senate has made sure we put money into the reserves, and we haven't really talked about that. It was just briefly said it's really important because we don't know the economic future a year from now, and we are concerned. That's number one. So we don't have all this money lying around. We're going to put $600 million into the reserves. Secondly, that's why I said we've got to do this local option. I think the problem with what's going on in the presidential races, there isn't enough imagination about our future and what we want to look like 20 years from now. If we want our young people to come back to Minnesota instead of migrating out, we need a comprehensive multimodal transit system. They may not have the foresight to envision how important that is to all of us. We do have that foresight, so give us the option. It's only $135 million from the state, not only, but not $2 billion. I just wanted to correct that. That would be the state share, but the state share would be $135 million. And so let us decide to do a local option where we can take care of that because we think we'll be doing you a favor that will pay off for decades to come.